Hi everyone, Phil Travis here, History 448, Modern Russia. This week's lesson is, per the reading, primarily looking at Nikita Khrushchev and the issues with Berlin and also Cuba. Nikita Khrushchev, as we talked about last week, with de-Stalinization, Nikita Khrushchev had, among many other things, very much felt that he had proposed a détente with the United States, and he saw this as through the lens of things like cutting back the size of the military. Nikita Khrushchev, multiple times, took significant steps against the wishes of many people in the Politburo to downsize the Soviet military. Nikita Khrushchev made overtures directly to the United States. He sought productive and cordial relationships with Eisenhower. He opened up and allowed for reforms in Eastern Europe, albeit, of course, Hungary was put down with great force, and of course, Emir Naj's execution certainly didn't look like reforms, but ultimately, countries like Poland had been allowed to reform within the Soviet Empire. Military troops had been removed from other portions of the Soviet Eastern Empire. And so Nikita Khrushchev had very much seen himself as proposing a détente with the United States. In exchange for this, in the late 1950s, Khrushchev was really looking for some kind of U.S. recognition of the Soviet Empire, recognition by the United States of East Germany and territories that the Soviet Union controlled that the United States considered occupied territories. And of course, the U.S. ambassador, Lewin Thompson, noted that the United States had, certainly from the eyes of Khrushchev, done virtually nothing to meet Khrushchev. And so in the 50s, Khrushchev was in a position in which he was under a great deal of pressure from hardliners within his own party, a great deal of pressure to show that he was winning the Cold War or that he was achieving successes for the Soviet Union, and he was really not visibly achieving a lot. And this led Nikita Khrushchev to take a few gambles with Berlin, gambles over Cuba, in the hopes that he could secure a major victory that would make him look good in terms of in the Soviet party apparatus, but also to achieve some basic things that he felt were fundamental for a peaceful coexistence between the United States and the Soviet Union. And of course, Nikita Khrushchev very much believed that a cooperative relationship was possible between the two. Berlin and, of course, Cuba will become two of the things that Khrushchev will really focus on. Germany was divided. Both sides of the German, East Germany and West Germany, were both pretty hawkish, militaristic positions or leaderships. East Germany demanded effectively that Berlin be demilitarized and ultimately incorporated into East Germany. And this was something that of course, really encouraged Khrushchev to action. Khrushchev, of course, makes an ultimatum on Berlin ultimately, basically saying that the United States would either demilitarize the west of Berlin, basically allow Berlin to return to be a part of East Germany, or he would allow the East German government to take its own action in the area, and therefore cutting off the Allies and ending agreements that went back to the Potsdam Agreement at the end of World War II. Of course, the United States, from its perspective, can't really recognize, it doesn't see a lot of these actions in the same light. They can't recognize East Germany. We view East Germany as occupied territory. But Khrushchev is not, Khrushchev is a largely misunderstood character in America. Most Americans thought of Khrushchev banging his shoe. They thought of Khrushchev as a person who is, fanatical even, which was very not true. Khrushchev was an emotional and passionate individual, but he was an individual who was seeking agreements, seeking negotiations, even if some of the negotiations were done with very hard language. He was seeking compromise with the West, and he very much felt that the West was was in response conducting economic warfare on the Soviet Union and militarizing, particularly after West Germany's Adenauer's proposal to move nuclear missiles into West Germany. Pictured here is Nikita Khrushchev with his three most famous cosmonauts, Tereshkova, Popovich, and of course Yuri Gagarin, the first woman in space. The Soviets very much were a leader in the space race, and Nikita Khrushchev tried to use this as a bargaining chip with the United States to get the United States to kind of, in his view, meet the Soviet Union halfway on what he saw as his proposals for détente. Soviet nuclear deterrence. Of course, the Soviet Union, even though in the United States, Americans, after Sputnik was launched in 1957, Americans were almost obsessed with the fear of a Soviet nuclear attack. But the truth of the matter was that the Soviet Union was at this time far more threatened by U.S. military positions. Of course, by 1960, the United States will place Jupiter missiles in Turkey. The West German government requests offer for missiles. There will be missiles going to other parts of Europe as well. And so ultimately, by the early 60s, Khrushchev saw himself the Soviet Union felt, from Khrushchev's perspective, very threatened. As well, the United States' Strategic Air Command, the United States had a nuclear capability to deliver atomic weapons on the USSR, and this was something that made the Soviet Union more vulnerable. Now, when the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first satellite in 1957, of course, this satellite had a beeper on it, and it traveled around the world, and Western press were obsessed with knowing its location, wondering if it was sending a secret code and these types of things. It encouraged the development of a lot of hysteria in the West over nuclear vulnerability, and of course it leads to the construction or the creation of NASA in the United States. It leads to the construction of the Interstate Highway Program in the United States. And even the Chinese really pushed Khrushchev to use this kind of this nuclear weapon, this nuclear missile, this ICBM, to exploit and take advantage of areas of the developing world. Khrushchev was more cautious. Khrushchev sought to use the ICBM certainly as a threat to the West, and of course, in your reading, it's clearly apparent when he meets with Senator Hubert Humphrey, future Vice President Lyndon Johnson. Of course, he famously, in having a relatively cordial relationship with Humphrey, the passionate and emotional Khrushchev circled Minneapolis, where Humphrey was from, and told him, we won't nuke this city. And of course, Humphrey responded saying, well, I can't guarantee the same for Moscow. But Khrushchev does try to use the missile gap, which was a kind of a myth that came about from the Soviets being the first to space, the first to launch a satellite. And they launched a satellite aboard this missile, this ICBM, the Soviet R-7. In reality, the R-7 had a lot of problems that we'll look at here, but Khrushchev is trying to use whatever advantage he can to try to get the United States to meet him on what he sees as a middle ground, which to a large degree involves, a recognition of the Soviet Empire. In the United States, like I said, when Sputnik was launched in 1957, and I encourage you guys to go back and watch the little links that I have in here, you'll find them very interesting. But in 1957, in reaction to this, there's a great deal of fear in the United States. There's presidential hopefuls like John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson who use the fear of nuclear annihilation at the hands of Russian missiles to attack the incumbent Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower and his vice president Richard Nixon. There's a formal report, the Gaither Report, that proposed the United States should increase its military spending by 50%. Admittedly, this is all in the face of the fact that the Soviets had actually cut their military spending back during Khrushchev's period of so-called peaceful coexistence. We create NASA, and of course, ultimately, the United States will position short-range Jupiter missiles, which were not, They were not like very threatening missiles. In truth, I mean, in terms of their technology, the Jupiter missiles that we put in Turkey were pretty. They were pretty antique, even for that technology at the time. But the U.S. does ultimately position short-range missiles in Turkey, built the Interstate Highway Project, and Eisenhower largely doesn't buy in. So Eisenhower largely kept his cool over this, despite the politics in the United States, largely because we were using this top-secret spy program with the U-2 pictured here to overfly Russia. And the United States knew that this was like false bluster. They knew that Khrushchev was basically bluffing about the Soviet Union's true nuclear capabilities. And because of this, Eisenhower doesn't lose his head. Albeit, though, the United States is still undergoing a huge buildup of nuclear weapons. Between 1958 and 1960, the U.S. nuclear arsenal more than doubles. Our weapons are becoming more efficient. Strategic Air Command, or SAC, was a more efficient method of attacking the Soviet Union than what the Soviet Union had in its missiles. By 1960, we have Polaris submarines that carry 16 missiles each and can launch nuclear missiles from a submerged position. And these were all advancing beyond the Soviet Union's capabilities. The Soviet Union was behind on a lot of aspects of nuclear technology. Their R-7 that launched Sputnik, the R-7 was not an efficient missile. It had to be refueled above ground. It was an easy target. It took a long time to refuel it with liquid fuel. And over the next 5 to 6 years, the United States really outpaces the Soviet Union. We were the first to really develop the miniaturization of our nuclear technology. We are the first to develop an efficient solid propellant. Our missiles are protectable and mobile due to silos and obviously the capability of submarines. Our adoption of the transistor gives us a huge advantage as well. Comparatively, the Soviets were slower to develop a lot of these technologies. And when the United States is developing smaller warheads that are more accurate, the Soviet Union is actually developing larger warheads on the basis of their thinking that since they couldn't be more accurate, they needed a large payload so that they could hit a target by just getting close. And of course, Khrushchev uses the scale of some of these Soviet warheads as a veiled threat in his negotiations with Senator Hubert Humphrey. In the late 50s, despite Khrushchev's pleading for a détente, the Cold War is really intensifying. You have another Taiwan Straits crisis in which the United States and the Chinese were engaged in intense situation in the Taiwan Straits over some small islands there. The United States had actually threatened to use atomic weapons against China if they attacked the islands. The islands largely were not inhabited, by the way. There's U.S. concern growing over Vietnam and conflict in Laos and Southeast Asia. The United States send U.S. troops into Lebanon, and ultimately we passed the Eisenhower Doctrine, which basically granted Eisenhower the authority to use force in that area of the world. Germany is obviously becoming a huge issue. The West German government was requesting, Adenauer's government was requesting delivery of nuclear weapons systems to West Germany, and this was very much a controversial thing for Khrushchev. Our old Cold War specialists, former Secretary of State Dean Acheson and Soviet specialist George Kennan, disagreed over the plan with West Germany over those missiles. Kennan, thinks that we should demilitarize and promote a unification of Germany. Acheson does not. Likewise, Khrushchev wants Berlin unified. He wants it basically made part of an East Germany that the United States would recognize, and of course the United States and NATO refuse. In Paris, 1960, of course, one of the big things that Khrushchev had wanted was a face-to-face with Eisenhower. He wanted to, Khrushchev was not a fanatic. He was deeply afraid of nuclear war, and he was a very passionate, emotional person. He was also somewhat of an anti-intellectual, but, he believed he had made an offer to the United States, and he wanted to meet with Eisenhower. He wanted to develop a personal relationship with Eisenhower by having firsthand meetings, and he ultimately does achieve these. And when he achieves these, he takes this as meaning that the United States is effectively taking the steps towards recognizing the Soviet Empire. Of course, things got a lot worse in 1960 when Powers' U-2 is shot down. Powers was able to safely parachute to the ground, and of course, Eisenhower in the United States denied it, and Khrushchev was shocked when he learned that Eisenhower had in fact been at the heart of the planning of these covert operations, which were designed, of course, to oversee the actual and evaluate the actual nuclear weapons capabilities of the Soviet Union. So ultimately, after Khrushchev makes his ultimatum over Berlin, that basically the Allies had to either demilitarize Berlin or that he would basically turn it over to the East German government and allow the East German government to effectively cut off the West in Berlin and consolidate it within East Berlin. After he makes his ultimatum, of course, he pushes the United States to, to sign a treaty that would recognize East Germany. Otherwise, he would allow the East German government to basically pursue the unification of the city as it saw fit. Khrushchev, though, does see East Germany and Russia, Soviet Union have different views on these issues, and very much Khrushchev was challenged not only by the West German government, but he was also challenged by the East German government. But East Germany was, or at least Berlin, West Berlin being in the heart of East Germany, was a problem for Khrushchev largely for these reasons. It was a location for espionage. Intellectuals often used it as a staging ground to migrate to the West, where there was better money and better pay and better living standards. There was also, a military position in West Berlin, which, of course, was certainly vulnerable, but nonetheless threatening to East Germany. Khrushchev really felt he had to do something, especially after the missile gap fallacy was exposed. And, of course, after the U-2 flight was shot down in 1960, the Paris summit falls apart. And in June 1961, he meets with Kennedy. And Khrushchev respected Eisenhower because Eisenhower was an old World War II guy, like Khrushchev. But he doesn't respect Kennedy, and he underestimates Kennedy. He tries to use his position to bully Kennedy, to force Kennedy to agree to this treaty that would ultimately allow Berlin to return into East Germany, would allow the United States to recognize the Eastern Bloc of the Soviet Union. And of course, as you read, Khrushchev very much liked to use hyperbole and exaggeration and hardline threats in these negotiations. But of course, it fails, and the conference, the conference falls apart, and ultimately, the response of Nikita Khrushchev is to build the Berlin Wall, which here you see a picture of the Berlin Wall from the 1980s. The Berlin Wall was actually, from Kennedy's perspective, the Berlin Wall was actually not a terrible thing. The Berlin Wall guaranteed the Kennedy administration that West Berlin would not be lost as kind of a psychological loss for the West. There's a lot of fear over Berlin, and this went back to the Berlin airlift in the late 40s. There was a fear that if you didn't defend Berlin, if you allowed West Berlin, to be basically incorporated as part of East Germany and the Eastern Bloc, that this would send a message to our allies that we weren't able to defend against communist incursions. So America's perspective on Berlin was rarely a strategic position. It was a psychological position. We didn't want to give it up because we didn't want to be perceived as being weak and making concessions to the Soviets. So when the walls built between East and West Berlin, it was basically, in a lot of ways, it was a win-win for the Kennedy administration. The Soviet Union looked bad and inhumane for building the wall, and the United States had a guarantee that there wouldn't be an East German-led attack on West Berlin. There was a great deal of fear that when Khrushchev made that ultimatum and he threatened, he said, hey, you'll either sign a treaty that guarantees demilitarization of West Berlin, or I'm going to let the East German government do as they please. That was effectively a threat that if you don't sign a treaty, there's going to probably be some shooting. That's certainly how it came off. And in the end, of course, the United States and the British ultimately, they called Khrushchev's bluff. And Khrushchev had given a deadline, and he pushes the deadline back. And then he meets with Kennedy, and he still tries to get it, and he uses his kind of hard line, sort of bluster, to promote the agreement, and the United States calls his bluff. And the end result is a division of Berlin that, from the Soviet perspective, was done largely to prevent cases of espionage and losing intellectuals to the West. But ultimately, it's really a win-win for the United States, contrary to the way we might immediately think about it. It wasn't it might have been perceived as something that was not great that happened on Kennedy's watch, but the Kennedy administration was really much more concerned about a possible war over West Berlin. They were far more concerned about East Germany, with the Soviet backing, taking action to effectively seize West Berlin and cut off the Western Allies and effectively nullify the agreements that were founded at Potsdam. So in a way, West Berlin meant that for the United States, the problem would go away. It made the Soviet Union look bad, and it pretty much guaranteed to the Allies that West Berlin would be, the Western Allies, I should say, that West Berlin would be left alone and would remain this vestige of Western support within the heart of East Germany, right on the edge of the Soviet bloc. Khrushchev's next attempt, of course, and I have that little film that I hope you guys watch. I mean, obviously you should, because there's a graded assignment attached to it, but that film's very interesting because it provides you a look at the other side when it came to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Of course, Cuba was sort of a vestige of the American empire for half a century. After the Spanish-American War in 1898, the United States didn't colonize Cuba, but we did take, through things like the Platt Amendment, the United States did take measures to assure that Cuba would be basically part of the United States' sphere of orbit. The United States had in place dictators. We had sent the military to Cuba at times to assure stability, and we had guaranteed kind of trade relationships that benefited the United States and the dictatorships that were in charge. Well, of course, in the 50s, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara overthrow the U.S.-supported dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista in a revolution in 1959. And of course, the United States really struggled with this. They tried to execute Castro or have him assassinated. They tried to, of course, Eisenhower's administration, the CIA under Eisenhower's administration, had planned the Bay of Pigs. And of course, the Bay of Pigs occurred during the Kennedy administration. And it was a complete debacle, of course, but that was an attempt by the United States to covertly, I say covertly because everybody kind of knew once the Bay of Pigs was happening that it was happening, but it was covert because the United States insisted that it had to be able to deny its responsibility in the Bay of Pigs. But it was a covert effort to overthrow the government of Castro, and of course these fail. After that, of course, the Soviet Union increasingly builds a relationship and alliance with Castro's Cuba. And this resulted in increasing aid to Cuba in the form of normal humanitarian aid, but also military supplies. Of course, before the missiles, the nuclear missiles had been placed in Cuba, the United States had placed missiles in Turkey. And of course, was considering placing missiles in West Germany, and these were highly antagonistic to Khrushchev. Khrushchev actually traveled to, the Crimea, the Black Sea area, and as you'll see in the documentary, he really questions. He says, "Why can't we put missiles on their doorstep? They have missiles on our doorstep." And so this was another example of Khrushchev kind of trying to play hardball with the United States, where he saw himself in a position where he really had to he had to be successful. He had to deliver to the hardliners in the Soviet Politburo, and where he also felt that he had to respond to the fact that the Soviet Union didn't really, at least from his perspective, didn't really feel that the United States had met them very fairly when it came to his overtures of détente. Of course, despite assurances from the U.S., the Soviet ambassador Gromyko, the USSR was placing nuclear missiles in Cuba. When Gromyko met with Kennedy and told Kennedy they wouldn't put offensive weapons there. However, Gromyko didn't know that the mission was already there. They were already sending the missiles to Cuba. And of course, another U-2 spy plane reveals these weapons deliveries, and Kennedy feels fundamentally betrayed. And in October of 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States actually advised that the United States attack the island. It was, in retrospect, a very good thing that an attack didn't occur. We found out after the Cold War ended that Cubans had been given the authorization from the Soviet Union to use the missiles that they had if they were attacked. And so an attack very, very, very well might have resulted in a thermonuclear war. So it was a very, very urgent time. But from the Soviet perspective, Khrushchev's perspective was, look, he was like, basically he's been trying to give to the United States. He's been trying to give from his perspective to meet in the middle with the United States, and the United States was playing a hard line with him. And so from his perspective, the missiles in Cuba was a matter of kind of doing what the United States had just done to him. And in his mind, it seemed perfectly reasonable and rational that he would choose this course of action because of the course of action chosen by the United States. So the United States and the Soviet Union were very much kind of on a standoff, and Khrushchev really felt that the United States was at least largely to blame for it, that they hadn't met him with the types of compromises and agreements that would help him as a leader in Russia, but also would make it possible for the two nations to cooperate. At least this is how Khrushchev saw it, how he expressed it. Kennedy, of course, was very pragmatic in the Bay of Pigs. In the Cuban Missile Crisis. During the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy had listened to a specialist, and then balked at the end on making a direct American attack to support the revolutionaries. When the Bay of Pigs happened, this attempted invasion to overthrow the Castro regime, the CIA had told him that basically all Kennedy had to do was just let it go forward, and everything would take care of itself. But the CIA misled Kennedy. They didn't tell Kennedy that Castro had found out, that they knew the attack was coming. They just assumed that Kennedy would do the airstrikes, and Kennedy did not want to implicate the United States in that effort. So Kennedy was kind of caught out by listening to the specialists who kind of implied to him that everything would go just fine, and that there wouldn't be a need for a direct kind of American intervention. So with the Cuban Missile Crisis, after the missiles were revealed in Cuba, Kennedy responded practically. He doesn't listen to the Joint Chiefs of Staff's advice to attack, and instead listens to figures like Robert McNamara, his Secretary of Defense, and they advise pragmatism, and they order a blockade. And the blockade would search Soviet ships going to Cuba, and they would force Soviet ships that were carrying weapons and missiles to turn around. And of course, as this is all happening, Kennedy and Khrushchev engage telegrams, and they come to a deal. And the deal was that the United States would remove its Turkish missiles in exchange for the Soviet Union removing Cuba's missiles. Ultimately, it looks bad for Khrushchev, though. The United States hides the fact that there was a deal made. They hide the fact that we gave up the Turkish missiles. And instead, it looks like it looks like the United States has merely stood up to Khrushchev and Khrushchev backed down. In reality, there was an agreement, there was a compromise, there was a bargain made, but the United States hides that bargain. And the result is that Khrushchev internationally, looks like he has failed. And this is really the end for Khrushchev as premier. Khrushchev had been seen as really taking big gambles when it came to Berlin and Cuba, and he was seen as coming up short. The United States called his bluff on both occasions. And from Khrushchev's perspective, he was looking at it from the standpoint where, he had taken big steps to promote demilitarization in Russia. He had taken big steps to allow reforms within the Soviet bloc. From his perspective, he was trying to create a détente with the United States, and he really felt that that the United States had not met him, kind of at an even stance, and so he was looking for ways that he could create a big victory for himself in the Soviet Union over first Berlin and then Cuba. And in both cases, he misjudged the position of the United States. And the United States called his bluff on both of those, and it really cost him his time as a premier in the Soviet Union. I hope this helps, guys. I hope this is helpful. And again, I encourage you to watch some of these links that I have on here when you get a chance. They're pretty interesting. One of them is the documentary that you're assigned to watch for this week. So anyway, let's have a great rest of the week. Thanks, guys.